welcome to the Hollywood Prospectus podcast. My name is Chris Ryan. I am a writer for Grantland.com, and on the other line is money long like Jarecki sideburns. It's Andy Greenwald.
I'm so happy you led with the sideburns.
Jarecki!
I didn't expect that. Jarecki. I mean, that's a good name. It has like a nice hard consonant sound.
Is somebody out there doing the Jarecki movie with Mark Maron as Jarecki yet?
Not yet, but the day is young. We're talking here. This is Monday. We're only hours removed from the exciting, the groundbreaking, the earth-shattering, the Twitter-affecting finale of HBO's series The Jinx, which clearly we're going to talk about today.
Nothing was the same.
Although, according to you, everything stayed the same.
No, we're going to talk about the Jinx. Yeah, man.
We're going to talk new music. We're going to talk Kendrick Lamar a little bit.
Word.
I feel like we should say at the top of the show what we're not going to talk.
We're not going to talk about the slap this week. Just events conspired to get in the way of slap. So we'll do double slap talk next week.
We're going to do double slap, both cheeks next week.
Sorry,
and next week's
Connie.
Aisha.
Yeah.
So it's going to be real. But
okay, so we'll do Connie and Aisha next week. I'll talk for 12 minutes straight about the slap.
I assume we've lost 50% of our listening audience right now, so now we can just get back to what matters most.
So let's talk a little bit about the Jinx. We had not chatted about this before.
Did not chat.
And then yesterday, I feel like the momentum over the last couple of weeks about it, I mean, everybody had been kind of like, this is such a compelling show. And there had been some chatter about like the Errol Morrissey recreations of the crimes that they had been discussing, these alleged Robert Durst murders. And then, man, it jumped up a notch.
It really escalated.
Yeah.
I mean, Bob killed a guy and two women.
That's not funny. Here's the problem. This isn't funny, right? I'm not allowed to laugh at this. This is the issue with a lot of these, like, when we kind of memify these, like, true crime shows, and then you realize you're laughing about real things, man.
I feel like it's worth saying something right at the top, and especially in response to two bits of criticism. One, what you just said, which is probably true. I mean, we're talking about three people who lost their lives, very likely because of this insane sociopath.
Right.
The other criticism that is all over the place today is a lot about, was the timeline futzed with, were they withholding information to keep him from the cops? What is Andrew Jarecki's moral responsibility as a crusader for justice? Both those arguments have validity. Mm-hmm. I am less interested in both of them than I am in the fact that The Jinx was a very well-made entertainment.
Yeah.
Like, it was a TV show. And I watched it as a TV show, I enjoyed it as a TV show, and I appreciated it as an act of constructed dramatic narrative.
Right.
And one thing that kind of makes me a little nuts about the way documentaries are often treated, and I think primarily by people who don't watch them often, I guess like myself in this case, but is that there's this assumption that they're pure.
That was good, because when you first started that point, I was like, defender of the documentary as an art form, and
if there's one thing missing,
docaholic Andy Greenwald.
If there's one thing missing from my Wikipedia page, it's definitely my deep, deep love of the nonfiction narrative medium. No, I just feel like all documentaries are fictionalized at some level. They all have a point of view. They all are constructed with an artistic end, or in this case, with some sort of prosecutorial end.
Yeah.
And I feel like that kind of gets lost often. And I think that rather than nitpick today on Monday, when the court case is just beginning, what Jarecki did or didn't do, let's just talk about what one thing we know he did do, which was make a very compelling 6-hour television show.
I will tell you one thing that he did do.
Yeah.
He explored all the settings on his electric shaver.
Yeah. Now,
there is some fine detail work going around right here. Viewers of the Coast to Coast podcast can see. I'm pointing to the area, the cheek area, the cheekle area.
You're pointing to the moneymaker. Is what you're pointing to. For talking heads like ourselves, this is really where it matters. And so when the truth bombs drop,
what do you think that setting was called? Is that called is that the calligraphy setting?
Oh, what on the shaver?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's called like leading the witness or something. There's something about it that is like trustworthy.
Yes.
It was sculpted and considered.
Like,
but let me put it this way. I was relieved to know that there was a massive time jump between the first interviews where he was wearing where Durst was wearing that nice Heather Gray sweater.
And Jarecki's got the salmon shirt on.
and what we saw last night, which was very much the finale was a lot of like behind the scenes stuff.
Yes.
Towards the very last moment.
Yes.
I was really relieved because honestly, I was watching Jarecki those first 4 episodes and I'm like, this was a choice. Like he knew he was going to be on TV, right? And like that's cool. A lot of people have had Squirrel Nut Zippers faces in their lives, you know? Like I don't judge. But it was a bold move. It was a bold move. And weirdly, more people on that show had goatees than out on the planet Earth that I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
I guess so. Yeah. Cody, he was rocking a goatee.
Cody. Okay. One other thing. Here's another reason why the show was good and why maybe documentaries are pretty good as someone who has literally never seen any of them. The faces of people who are actually police officers is fantastic.
Yeah. They're not very much like Dominic West.
They're not like Dominic West. And they have so much more personality, both in the way that they look and the way that they are.
Yeah, Cody was like...
Cody was an intense dude. The Westchester dude who's, again, people watching us on YouTube will understand the depth and breadth I'm giving to my skull region. But also the Manhattan cop, the sort of wiry guy who was retired, who was the one who was initially investigating Bob Durst's wife's death 30 years ago. He is like a Richard Price character come to life. You know, I'm going to compare him to a fictional cop. He kind of had like a Richard Belzer thing going on.
Yeah, a little bit.
And I think he's the cop who early on is basically like, as a homicide detective in New York City, you see things that can never be unseen. Civilians will never understand what I see. And my wife is sitting there being like, what's on his necklace? Because his shirt was open more than mine was. And I'm like, pretty sure that says Super Dad.
I thought it said like boss of all bosses.
So the faces and the characters. I mean, this was a very fascinating world.
Yeah, it was a rich tapestry. It was a great ensemble. I mean, like if you're talking about it in terms of an entertainment, can I just jump in and actually say another positive thing about this?
Before you bring down the hammer? Yeah.
No, so when I first moved to New York in 2000, one of the great parts about living there, and this is going to sound unnecessarily nostalgic, but hear me out, was the New York specific media that was there.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
So I loved every whatever day it was of the week. I used to really make time for the new Village Voice. Like we would get really excited when the Village Voice would get delivered to Mondo Kim's, where I worked on St. Mark's, and they would bring in a bunch of voices. And we would all like kind of devour it to see what the lead review was and see who was coming to play shows and stuff like that. And that was back, you'd get up every morning and you'd wake up with New York One, and like on the way to the subway, I would always get a poster of Daily News and just kind of like read about these insane characters that like it's a time that's kind of gone now from my life. I'm sure that other people still live it, but it was just seeing those headlines, those New York Post splashy tabloid headlines.
Oh, yeah.
There's like a New York Magazine, I think, article written by Nick Pileggi, who went on to write Goodfellas and all those. You see these names and you're just like, man, what a town.
I totally agree. And for me, I mean, you and I both lived in New York when
Hold on a second,
Bob
buddy.
Durst. What if you just pitched over the side?
You were saying.
Hey, man.
Hey, you totally agree.
I totally agree with you. You and I both lived in New York during this time when Bob Durst was on trial in Texas for dismembering his neighbor.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I had no actual knowledge what any of this was, because his name was like Brooke Astor or these other names that were just always on the back pages.
Yeah, where they would get something, like the tabloids would get something in their craw for like 6 to 8 weeks, and it would just be a story about it every other day, and like they would find their fall guy, and you could just see it from 2 weeks out that this guy was going down, like.
Yeah. And so I think that leads to one of the potential criticisms of the Jinx, which is I wasn't sure if there were people who were clearly obsessed with these cases and have been following it for many years. There are also people who knew all of this stuff, who read those papers past the garish headlines and were following these cases, and didn't seem to be that much new evidence. So what was the most compelling thing about the first half of the Jinx, the first 3 episodes, was just Durst himself.
Yeah.
Who's just like a character you've almost never seen on TV before, with these outlandish blinks and these seemingly obvious tells and this weird like sociopathic remove from the details of these violent acts that occurred around him.
Yeah, it's so fascinating too to watch. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about the show, it was sort of tangential to it, was all of Kathy Durst's friends who became sort of amateur detectives over the course of the case, and how that sort of mirrored by the end of the show how many people online were amateur detectives, or at least fact checking the Jarecki's and Smerling's work, and that kind of called back to the way people were with Serial and how that had sort of awoken a sort of collective detective, inside of a lot of people. And it's a really interesting phenomenon. I'm sure that it's just been given like a larger stage because of Reddit and Twitter and Facebook and the ability to share links and to have a community of people to talk about this stuff with. Do you think that it creates like a remove or a distance? Is it a distancing thing when we're experiencing these things, these truly heinous crimes through these artifacts of popular culture? Do you think it does divorce us from the reality of the situation, or do you think that would happen anyway if you're just looking at these totally like eye-grabbing New York Post headlines?
I think it's a good question, and I think it's a hard one to answer. I think what makes this case kind of unique is that these cases were essentially cold.
Yeah.
I mean, he was tried for one of them and then acquitted. Nobody other than amateur detectives were trying to put it together. He was
Jarecki's an amateur
freak
detective,
show. And an oddity, exactly. But so Jarecki had a camera, and he was himself an amateur detective. And did you see the fictional movie he made about this called All Good
Yes,
Things?
I did.
How was that?
Not great. Yeah.
Even though it had the gauze?
Yeah, I think that it just had. It's interesting to know that he obviously, by the end of the Jinx, comes to such a. The pose he has in the initial few episodes, and he cops to this, where he's like, it's not that I thought he was innocent, but I thought he might not be guilty, or he said something along those lines. And I definitely think that he's charmed by Durst for some of that time.
Well, here's another thing that didn't really get much play, which is that one of the more compelling things about Bob Durst is that he is the oldest son of the kind of Titanic character that doesn't seem to exist anymore. So his father, I think Sheldon Durst, or
when they were rattling off
Seymour Durst.
the Durst real estate holdings in Manhattan, it's almost incomprehensible that someone could own that much of Manhattan.
That much of Manhattan.
Yeah.
So his father, was this titan of the city, and Bob Durst was the oldest child and had a horrific childhood with this distant, successful father and a mother who committed suicide basically in front of him. His younger brother, who was born without the obligations or the pressure, seemingly, went off to Stanford, describes himself as having had a hippie phase.
A Berkeley hippie, yeah.
Takes over the company, Berkeley, right, takes over the company and has all the success, and Bob Durst is ignored. Now, that's on the record, that's in the Jinx. What isn't covered in the Jinx is that Andrew Jarecki is the second son of a multimillionaire also, a major figure in New York philanthropy, Henry Jarecki. And Andrew's older brother followed in his father's footsteps in making money in financial markets.
Okay.
And Andrew was sort of the second son who could become
Is that
an
how
artist.
Andrew gets into the Children's Hospital benefit where he confronts Douglas?
I don't know, but that's a question worth asking.
Okay.
And it's also interesting, again, it's not ascribing any motive, but that's another interesting wrinkle to the story.
Yeah,
why,
if anything,
why
I
Andrew
think that
Jarecki
his understanding of the upper crust of New York and money in New York, and the way that people in New York with that kind of money interact with and use the media as a tool is fascinating. And it jumps this show up from just like an investigation of a cold case that you could watch on any sort of A&E true crime show.
That's right. And what was truly spectacular about it, I think, was the ending, which was totally unlike anything I think we've seen on TV before. And I think it's worth talking about it just not in the context of justice, not in the context of did this cause the LAPD to have him arrested on Saturday, which he was, and now he's being extradited to California.
Right.
But let's just talk about how one thing that we can all agree on with TV in 2015 is that we are way too focused on sticking the landing. We are way too focused on getting the ending right, as opposed to the journey, which is what most TV shows are about. And here we are with a show that had an absolutely dynamite, unique, probably not repeatable ending. I mean,
you wouldn't believe it if it was a fictional television show.
You wouldn't believe it. And as many people have said on Twitter and other places, this is the ending that people who became obsessed with Serial kind of wanted, probably.
Right. It's like
right?
Adnan talking to Sarah and saying, like, I did it. Yeah.
Well, guess what? Yeah, people want resolution. And now, again, I paid as much attention to Serial as I do to documentaries in general.
Right.
But I think, that's an example. It's another example of what we're talking about, where people are a little bit too fixated on resolution as opposed to the exploration and the journey. That said, at the end of the finale last night, and again, props to everyone involved for making this 6 episodes, because that was enough.
Yeah.
Like 8 episodes would have been too many. He sits him down for the second interview, and they hit him with the handwriting. And for me, the more incredible thing wasn't what happens in the bathroom afterwards. It's when he just starts uncontrollably burping.
Yeah, as if like he's sort of exorcising these lies or whatever. Yeah.
Like, it is such a human and terrifying moment. And again, you said we wouldn't believe things if they were fiction. This was a human tell that like would be too much if it was an actor's choice.
Yeah, Rich Juzwiak on Gawker has written a couple of times about sort of the physical manifestations of Durst's lies. A couple of really interesting posts, and the twitches and the eye blinking and stuff like that. And it's incredible to see these kinds of like, when all streams converge into a river, and you see, people complaining about the New York Times spoiling the Jinx. Like, Robert Durst spoiled a couple of things on his own. So I think that, like, I understand that's like frustrating if you're like, well, I didn't know how the Jinx ended, but the Jinx is not lost. It's something that's chronicling something that's real. You can't.
Although, to be fair, this goes back to the first point we had. Like, I didn't feel in any way upset that the LAPD spoiled my enjoyment of the finale by arresting him.
Yeah.
Right. But I would have been upset if I had gotten the push notification that apparently people on the West Coast did 3 hours before they had a chance to see the show, that said, literally, in Jinx finale, Durst says, "I killed them all." So that's the equivalent. I knew the show was ending. I knew real life was a thing, but that's ruining a narrative choice. I mean, that was... Again, they ended the show with no editorializing past that audio that they had.
That was interesting. The choice to go to black after that was a very interesting choice.
I like that.
A little David
really
Chasian, like in a way. It was like it was there's no title card, there's no Jarecki one-on-one afterwards. It was just, it kind of let Durst walk the plank himself and then backed away from the splash,
Exactly, and I think that was a rare and very good example of just restraint.
Yeah.
And it wasn't something I would have expected for the 40 minutes leading up to it in last night's episode, which focused almost solely on Jarecki and his team.
Yeah.
Like riding around in cars, leaving voicemails, talking about how nervous they were. It was too navel-gazy, honestly. I mean, because they had run out of story, and then they had become the story.
Yeah. So we'll be interested to see how this plays out. We'll have to revisit it when some more shoes drop.
Well, the shoes are dropping out near you, right? So I assume you're just going to be a court reporter. Since he's coming out to LA for a trial.
Yeah.
I think the more interesting thing, I mean, the Durst thing is what it is. Like, if the people related to his victims can find closure in this, if they can finally prosecute him, he's a 71-year-old man. Like, the closure would be good. His own, in terms of paying for his crimes, I have no idea what's to come. What's more interesting to me going forward would be looking at how TV responds to this, because I don't think the Jinx was necessarily a ratings blockbuster. Certainly not, and it certainly didn't have the sort of vibe or zeitgeisty whatever.
Yeah, but isn't this exactly what HBO lines up for in the morning? Is this kind of conversation starter?
Well, now that's what I mean. It didn't have it through 4 episodes. It seems to have gotten it like crazy in the last 2.
Right.
And
but you've always said that they could care less about the ratings as long as people are talking about it.
People, they want to be talked about, and they want to and now that they're switching to a more direct subscription model, they want a backlog of content. But I think I told you also that when I did that executives panel in LA in the end of the year with the heads of networks, they were all just talking about Serial and how they could get that same conversation going about TV shows. And so the concern is what's next, because nothing could be worse than a rash of like Cowboy Justice series.
There's an interesting... the way that Serial and Jinx are different is interesting, because Jinx obviously sort of, the conversation around the Jinx peaked at the end, and it was almost like this delivery system for this resolution.
Right.
Whereas with Serial, the hype and the conversation around Serial peaked somewhere in the middle, and then it was a conversation about like, can they stick the landing? Can they fulfill everybody's expectations about it? And I thought they did a fine job producing a very compelling radio documentary, but it didn't finish the job. You know what I mean? Like, it ended with he's going to get an appeal from, and so the idea that you can just replicate this, and frankly, it's a little bit disturbing that you would be looking for criminal cases with which to replicate starting a conversation. These are people's lives. I enjoyed it. I tend to personally prefer crime fiction to true crime, but
me too.
That's only because the things that I'm interested in about crime are very rarely the truth. And that's that was interesting to hear over and over again over the last few episodes of the Jinx, and that was a large part of the conversation about Serial is what really happened, who's not telling the truth, all these other things. Like, I'm a little bit more curious about some of the other things that happen in and around crimes than I am about what's the truth.
I totally agree with you, and I found myself more drawn in by the aspects of the Jinx that were ultimately sort of tangential to the story. Like the first episode that sort of laid out Durst's history in detail that is not disputed about his mother, about his brother.
The early days of his relationship with Kathy and like the Vermont health food store and like
this idea that maybe there was another way.
There was a point where like there was like a sliding doors point where he could have gone this other way and been just like a granola nut up in Vermont and been left alone, and he gets drawn back into this cobweb of deceit and money and stuff. And maybe he wasn't. Like, you never. Now you have to question every bit of his account of their story, But
what you're talking about, those are the building blocks to like a great character. And that's not what the Jinx was, because it's a real person who probably killed 3 people. And so, I'm glad you're saying that, because that speaks to what I think we share in terms of I wanted good stories.
Yeah,
I want good stories first and foremost. Yeah. And when it gets derailed by not only reality and the truth, but this expectation of the truth, and I think it sort of sinks.
Well, and it's also interesting because in a novel, you would never not get Deb to talk. You would never get.
You wanted more Deb.
I wanted more Douglas. I want Deb, and I mean, like all these people, like this suggestion that Douglas and Seymour might have known about some version of the truth of Robert for quite some time, and basically, while not suppressing it, distanced themselves from it. Which is sort of suggested in episode 5 that there's he's got these recreations of these boardroom meetings of what looks like the Durst family. Basically
just
being
colluding.
And I thought that was interesting. In a movie, that would be very interesting. In a quote-unquote documentary, there's a lot of responsibility. Like, was there a collusion meeting between the patriarch and the younger brother there to like protect the company via protecting Robert? I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's this part of me that wants the good story that is sympathetic to this idea of a fundamental tragedy. Yeah. That because of
that
what
it's an American tragedy, that you could do this thing that's like, look at the fall of this family.
Right, and look at his need for help and for control and to get attention and all these things that he did. But as what you're building to is exactly right. At the end of it, no, these are real cases. There's real crimes. Yeah. And there's a real matter of justice at the end of it. And that's a messiness that I don't think people, and I'm including myself in this, people who, especially people like myself who watch narrative TV for a living, I don't think we're well equipped to have this conversation. And yet I think people are insisting on having it today online, and I think that's a shame.
Yeah. You said something a couple minutes ago that I thought we would tease out a little bit, because I know that you wrote a little bit. You got something about Community that went up today, and then you're going to be writing about Bloodline later this week. This week, yeah. New Netflix show with Kyle Chandler and Ben Mendelsohn. And you were talking a little bit about how you're glad it ended at 6 episodes. The Jinx ended at 6 episodes, and this idea that, knowing what you have, knowing how long it's going to take to tell your story, and whether or not, I've been thinking about this because of so much stuff now has been revived, or there's hints of a reunion. One of our favorite shows of the last, probably in the duration of this podcast, Happy Endings, there's been rumors that Happy Endings might come back in some capacity. People are always banging on about a Party Down reunion. Veronica Mars came back. All these shows that were fan favorites.
Twin Peaks.
Yeah, Twin Peaks is coming back for better or for worse. And you were talking to me a little bit before the podcast about this idea of like, when enough is enough, and how you were kind of glad that Friday Night Lights didn't turn into an 8 or 9 season ER style behemoth where you did changeover of the high school every couple of seasons. And
well, it's not just that. It was that,
and we're talking about that because of Chandler, but we're also talking about that since Community is just, it won't die.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. I mean, well, let's separate them out. I mean, there was a great Hollywood Reporter cover story on Kyle Chandler, who just seems like a real G.
Still is like 100 emojis. Just
he just
showing
lives
up
in
to
Texas.
Austin bars in a pair of chinos, doing like 3 tequila shots, and then like going to his daughter's basketball game or something.
Not just that, 90-degree Texas heat,
Yeah.
a dry heat, pulling up to the bar at the Driscoll Hotel and asking for an oaky Cabernet.
Yeah.
Just like a real chewy
Something
tannins,
like a little
you know?
bit of peat moss in it.
Yeah, just like forest floor and blood.
Yeah.
He says in this piece that he's the one who pulled the plug on the potential Friday Night Lights movie.
Right.
Now, apparently there was some interest in Jason Katims, who adapted the show for TV and ran the show, was interested enough in the possibility that he wrote a script. And this is a movie of the TV show, so a movie that would continue the story of the TV show after the end of the 5th
with everybody
season.
in their different places, like so Coach and Tammy in Philadelphia.
Well, but theoretically they would have to be brought back together for some reason.
Right.
And, as soon as you say that, it's not... it's just immediately not worth doing. Like if a movie has to spend half of it getting the pieces back together, it's either not a movie or it's a Hobbit movie, right? Like it's not a real thing that's of narrative interest. So
I would definitely watch Coach and Tammy do the dishes for 45 minutes, but I see what you're saying.
it's a fair point. I
Little
would love
Hobbit
to see
joke
them
for you there.
I would love to see them together. But apparently Chandler was like, this is a terrible idea. I don't want to do it. And
Right.
that ended it. And I just wanted to, this whole thought that we're going to start talking about eventually, even though we're doing the dishes now, is that's a great thing. Like,
Yeah.
we need to start accepting that we can leave well enough alone. And we're starting to see it on TV as we're moving towards finite stories, limited series, event series. And that's great from a creative standpoint because, even a show I didn't really like True Detective, like, he could do his story beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah.
Good or ill, like, that's the story you wanted to tell. Fargo was good for the same reasons. But we really need to start thinking about it also from an audience perspective, because the strongest stories aren't built to run forever.
Right.
And so...
Right.
to
Well,
bring it all the way
especially
full circle,
your point about True Detective is especially a good one because something that if you're a fan of that show and you are honest with yourself, something that by episode 4 is that, and this is actually for as many problems as people have with True Detective, my problem was that I just always felt like Russ Cold needed to die. Like, that was sort of his destiny, was to confront that darkness and not make it out. Like, that was what made sense for his character. And that it was almost as if he was so unbelievably popular and had become such like a content factory on his own of witticisms and like aphorisms and all this other stuff that you can't kill Rust, you know what I mean? Like, it's like killing Han Solo. But like, in terms of what he thought of the universe, he needed to die. You know what I mean? And so the fact that they got to that point at all, at least considering it, was great. The fact that they didn't tease that out for another 2 or 3 seasons or crisscross time for another 2 or 3 seasons was the right thing to do.
That was the right thing to do, but that's really interesting the way you phrase that, because I think you're right. The show was done when it aired, so it's not like they were responding to any fan interest in keeping the character alive. But that's one of the things that felt like a cop-out to me, because you have the perfect setup where he could die. If the True Detective was an ongoing series, there's no way you kill your golden
Yeah, and I don't think anybody's
like,
I can't believe you killed... It's not like you're killing Sam on Cheers. It's like, that's
right.
End of the series.
Although if True Detective was planning on running 8 seasons, it would have been exactly like that.
Right, exactly.
But I think the problem with that was that, I think that Pizzolatto fell in love with his character a little bit too much, to be honest. I mean, I don't know his psychology.
Well, I don't think it's uncommon in detective stories for the detective to live no matter what.
But those detective stories are generally built on the presumption of further adventures. I mean,
sure, good point.
That itself is an archetype that but you're right. I mean, when I'm reading like a Raymond Chandler book
or a James Crumley novel where those guys experience some pretty traumatic stuff,
but always keep going, and that is. You're right. In fiction, one of the essential character traits of the detective, in caps, is essentially immortality. That they can be punched forever,
right,
and beaten up forever, but always
or
keep
in
coming,
James Crumley's case, have to dig their own grave while packing their broken nose with cocaine.
Right, which is what makes James Crumley the best crime writer of all time. But that's a digression for another show, one that we will continue to return to, or at least tease, but maybe never actually record. It came up in regards to Community, which I wrote about today, because Community has been resurrected yet again. It's beyond... I mean, you can't call it unlikely anymore, because now that's almost the expectation, that somehow this show will continue to survive.
Yeah. So you've seen episodes of the new season?
Yeah, so NBC finally pulled the plug on it after 5 seasons, and then Sony, the studio, who I've likened to Ed Harris, and Community is Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio
I did
in
not
The
know
Abyss.
where you were going with that. I was like, Ed Harris
and you know,
in The
it's
Rock?
my favorite, my favorite scene in The Abyss, and he's pounding on her chest, and he brings her back to life. That's the way Sony is with Community. They got Yahoo to buy it because Marissa Mayer has a lot of things going on, but like having money to burn is not a problem. So it's the sixth season is essentially their debut in the original scripted space, as they call it.
Yeah.
It's debuting tomorrow. We're recording Monday, so Tuesday, with 2 episodes, and then there are 13 in total. I've seen 2.
Are they putting? What's the increments they're putting them up in?
They're doing weekly. They're doing 2 tomorrow and then 1 a week. And it's fine. And here's the thing. Almost any sitcom in its 6th season, the best you can hope for is fine. I mean, you tune into the sitcoms because of the rhythms that are familiar to you and the characters you love.
Right.
What's interesting about seeing Community in this kind of late-stage decline is that it is a show that has always been so cognizant and aware of its own mechanisms.
Yeah.
Like Dan Harmon intentionally short-circuited all the obvious tropes. So any like intramural romance or flirtation, he was like, that's garbage. We don't do that.
Right.
We will point out the flaws. We will talk about them. In the season 6 premiere, Abed is basically like, I feel like this is the end of what I call our show, because we used to be a group of misfit students hanging out, and now we're like a loosely affiliated group of students and teachers who don't even take classes together anymore. What are we? And it's like, okay, well, that's very clever. You're talking about it. But by pointing out the cracks, you're really not helping anything. It's just still the cracks.
I think that there are 2 things that are going on here. That one thing is that obviously, like usually what happens is these shows develop followings that exponentially increase after the show is over. So, you know, even something like Friends, which has been discovered by like untold generations of people in its life on Netflix, apparently, or Gilmore Girls in the same way, where it's like these shows that, you know, Friends was obviously a juggernaut, but Gilmore Girls was struggling while it was on. And if it, you know, half the people who watch it on Netflix now had watched it back then, it probably never would have been in danger of being canceled. Community is like that, where it's always sort of been treated like this endangered species, and its fans have treated it as such, like where it was very protective. When you get into that protective nature, you're not really thinking about what's best for the show. You're thinking about what's best for you, which is fine.
That's
you
right.
know, like that's if that's your relationship to television, that's totally fine, because I have that relationship to some shows for sure. But you wind up not thinking. Community is one of those strange sitcoms that actually could have been like True Detective. It could have been truly weird and ended. You know what I mean? Like it had some of that weirdness and some of those dark episodes and some of those weird plot lines that they could have just been like, yeah, and then the school burns down, and that could have been the end, you know.
But it kind of was. I mean, when Harmon's last episodes in season 3, where everyone had a mental breakdown and Greendale was revealed to potentially be a psychotic institution where they were all being trapped and hallucinating a school, and then they sort of backed away from that, and then he was fired.
Yeah.
And then season 4, which is now being referred to as a gas leak year, where 2 other people were brought in and made a weird ventriloquist dummy version of the show that was lousy. Could have ended then. Then Harmon came back triumphantly. His first 4 episodes in season 5 were great.
Yeah.
And then it kind of got bad. And then the end of season 5, it was just felt like a giant shrug. And the end of season 5 was like a meteor is about to hit the school.
Yeah.
So it was that. And what's interesting to watch about Community, it's not just that the show kind of feels tired. And there are pleasant moments, and Keith David and Paget Brewster are on the show now, and they're nice and good performers, and it's fine.
Yeah.
But it's pretty clear that Dan Harmon, who is a very interesting personality and a very heart and everything else on his sleeve kind of storyteller, it seems he's not that interested in it anymore. You know, he is now chained to the machine that he was kind of raging against. And what's interesting to see is that in the first 2 episodes, the only thing in those 2 episodes that is totally crazy, totally unique, just shot through with the same
energy
anarchy and adrenaline,
the second half of the first season had,
is a throwaway trailer gag for a Portuguese knockoff of Gremlins that is referenced as a joke earlier in the episode.
Right. Well, that goes back to
poured
Harmon's
so much
aesthetic.
energy into making this.
Right. Right. And the articles about Harmon, you know, Papademos wrote one a couple years ago. It's just his attention to detail and the things that he gets fixated on are what elevates it beyond just any other random. I mean, it's what makes it so that other people can't come in and run that show. It's like you have to have his particular genius to actually make a show like that. Talking more about Bloodline, though.
Yeah.
Oh, no, were you going to jump in and say something about Community?
I did want to jump in with one other thing. It's interesting that we're talking about shows that have a story to tell and get out of there, and shows that go on and on and on. I mean, generally that's a divide between sitcoms and dramas. Because a sitcom is generally, although that's changing now that sitcoms are just more serialized, and it certainly was the case with like Parks and Recreation, sitcoms generally didn't have a story to tell. There was a place, they were a place to hang out.
Yeah, it was like a workplace thing. Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about dramas, and if I'm really going to hold fast to my new rule about like how it's okay to get canceled and sometimes one season is enough, I mean, I always hold up FX's show Terriers as my favorite show of the last few years. I wish it had run for a long time. It had one season. But here's what I'll say. Terriers told a great story in one season, and it ended really well, and it holds up on its own. It's okay that I'm okay with it. I'm at peace with it, because the story that it was telling was there. I mean, it was the kind of show that in many ways was going to be more like a sitcom, in that you wanted to spend time with these characters as they got up to misadventures. There could have been
countless cases they could have done, but yeah, I know what you mean.
There wasn't one big thing. Whereas The Americans, which we're not going to talk too much about because we know your feelings about it, and I like to keep our friendship steady. We already mentioned True Detective once, and that's our trigger. The ratings for this third season best yet, are lousy. Lousy. And John Landgraf, the head of FX, has said, and I kind of believe him, that it's going to run, he thinks it can run 5 seasons. And I think the more he says that, the more people making the show are like, okay, we have 5 seasons, we better make good on it.
Yeah.
But if The Americans were to end after this season, I would be very upset, because there is a story that they are telling. And it is definitely not going to be resolved at the end of the season in 6 weeks.
Right, because it's like they haven't even gotten to like Kirby Puckett in the World Series yet.
They haven't even gotten to the best part of the 80s. No, but like it's an interesting place to be with a show where I'm like, I want more of it, I want more of it. But with a show like The Americans, which is sort of built on a dare, and there are other shows like this too.
Yeah.
No, I know what you mean. They're going to get found out. Yeah. They're going to be found out. There's going to be something at the end where they are discovered, where one of them, someone is killed, or they defect or something. Like, terrible things are on the horizon, and kind of both want to get there and kind of want to avert my eyes. It's interesting the way we process the life cycle of these shows.
Well, it's always okay as long as it's not your kid, right? So it's like we can talk tough when it comes to the shows that like we're like, hey, lighten up, community nerds. Why don't you guys let go? You know what I mean? But then it's when it's our shows, or when it's like if you're like telling me like, I don't know, like if you had cut Justified off after season 1, I would have been bummed out if you had.
But it's also the other half of it that we're neglecting, which is like all the people who work on Community.
Yeah.
Are like, this is a pretty sweet job. It's fun. Like Joel McHale, early guest on the Hollywood Prospectus podcast, by the way, loves the show. He loves being a part of the show. He is, instrumental in keeping it alive and getting Dan Harmon back. And, I bet if we got a few drinks in him, sat down with him, he'd probably admit that maybe the scripts for season 6 aren't as good as the scripts for season 3. But it's apparently a great place to work. He works with his friends, and it's fun. And so that's the other half of it. Like, there's nothing inherently evil in continuing a show past its sell-by date if people are enjoying their jobs and it's pleasing some people. It's just that we also do expect. It's tough when you expect greatness from something when goodness is hard enough to do.
Now, have you gotten a chance to see Bloodline at all?
I'm just digging into it. Just
getting the Key West sand between your toes.
As I've said at this table, at this microphone, love a Florida show. Love the look of it. Love the soft pastels.
We were talking the other day. Greenwald's a big Florida guy.
I love Florida. I think Florida is the weirdest, most interesting place in America.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah, that's your New Orleans.
New Orleans is pretty great too. You know what? To be honest, I like Southern Florida and New Orleans for a lot of the same reasons, which you can drink in public.
Yeah.
No, but they both feel like these weird peninsulas jutting out from America that are not quite this country, that are deeply influenced by other countries and other cultures, and then particularly in Florida. And I kind of hope Bloodline picks up on this, although the vibe I have so far is that it's not. Like, there's a Florida that is this incredible vision of a hybrid culture of American and Cuban, Caribbean and Latin American and Haitian. And
somehow I get the impression that Sam Shepard is not the patriarch of a Cuban American family, but
cigar rolling
stranger
dynasty.
Things have happened. Yeah,
I would rather see that, to be honest. But then that version of Florida exists next to just the Florida Man Twitter feed.
Well, also
where
I think that
kind of like
there's the Elmer Leonard Florida too, right? Of
yes.
U.S. Marshals and bandits kind of crisscrossing the state and hiding out in foreclosed upon condos and stuff, and
it feels
that's my favorite Florida. Yeah,
me too. I've been reading a lot of Elmore Leonard books recently. Just closed off La Brava. I'm reading Bandits now. I mean, these are visions of of crime stories of America, of Florida that I love and I wish we could see more of on TV. For the second time, we're talking about Bloodline without actually talking about the show. So, I mean, maybe we should just table it for next week.
Yeah, let's table it for next week because I'm sure I'll watch
you,
some of it this weekend.
You were a Damages guy, right?
Loved
These
it.
are the guys who
first
made
two
it.
seasons of Damages are like first season, but like the first season, 2 seasons are like criminally underrated.
My vibe that I've gotten from the show so far.
Did you watch the first season of Damages?
I've seen the first season of Damages.
That's crack.
Well, that's what I've been saying. I think that they are these guys. What I forget their names.
Zellman and Kessler.
ZKZ or something, like whatever they call themselves. They seem like a really, really good fit for Netflix in a way that a lot of the other people they've gone into business with maybe haven't been.
Was the last season of Damages on Netflix?
I think it was on DirecTV.
DirecTV.
I think they did one of those deals. But in the sense that, and this is the vibe I've gotten from the show and from people who've watched more episodes so far than I have, it is that thing. Mm-hmm. They're doing that thing again where they are grabbing you and they're tying you in knots and it's all kind of a high wire act. And you immediately get the feeling that season 3 of the show might be awful.
They got to get that Netflix money before the Duplases take it all.
Take it all. I know. I mean, I haven't. Anyway, I have not. I'm not officially putting an opinion out about.
You know, when you drive through, you sort of you're taking the 2 in Los Angeles, and you're driving past Eagle Rock. You can see the money coming out of the hills, and Mark Duplass is just sitting there lighting $1,000 bills on fire.
And then he was just at South by Southwest giving a keynote, just being like, "You need to cake like me."
Just create with your friends, man.
He's like, if you're tired of studio bosses dancing in your videos, you need to come. You need
to come. Duplass. That's amazing.
Can you imagine? Like those guys are empire building.
Yeah,
for real.
Yeah.
I mean, we're joking about it, but Netflix. Not only did they make a deal with Netflix for like 4 to 6 movies, but
and then they sold another one on top of it. Yeah.
On top of that, and they're doing Togetherness season 2. They keep caking up.
Yeah, man. Let's wrap things up with a quick conversation about this Kendrick Lamar album. So much to the chagrin of bloggers everywhere, To Pimp a Butterfly. Also, much to the chagrin of TDE CEO. You know, the TDE CEO was not pleased about that.
Wait, really? So this was totally
he was
a surprise?
like, I can't believe Interscope fucked up our release.
So what happened? So
I get the impression like possibly the clean version was accidentally put up, and when that became the case, they had no choice but to put up the dirty version. But that didn't. I mean, he was mad. Maybe there's just miscommunication. But
because the album was supposed to be released a week from tomorrow.
It was the 23rd, right?
Right. Yeah, and then it was suddenly last night, and I didn't even know. The way I knew that it was out was because my man Chris Ryan here sent an email to the Grandland staff after I went to bed, being like, "Hey, guess what?"
Yeah, well, really? So the funny thing about that, not to get insider baseball, is that this is a very difficult record to talk about because we're used to now being like, Drake leaked, my favorite song is Legend, but the secret best song is Star 67. You know what I mean? Like, and you have like this, your take is kind of fully formed upon its birth. This is going to be a very slow burner. I mean, this is a dense record. Like last night, we saw our buddy John Caramonica tweeted out the first Sa-Ra record, which he's referring to like this sort of Afrofuturist rap group from the mid-2000s being like an influence, or like kind of the Kendrick record reminded him of it. It's very deeply dirty and funky and is not hook laden, and it's going to take a second to get your mind around it.
There's nothing about this project lends itself to the kind of facile take that it's going to get today, tomorrow, Wednesday. It's another sign of why I think Kendrick is a really smart person and a very important artist, because he's just not playing that game. He's going to lose the battle in terms of the news cycle around his album release, but he was probably going to win the war. And I think the same thing happened with Good Kid, Mad City.
Jarecki came and took Kendrick's spot.
Jarecki stole his thunder.
Jarecki got the Kendrick setting on his shaver. Like, yeah,
but honestly, every other rapper is getting a note that says cadaver.
Right
now because he is playing a much longer game now. If you want an instant hot take,
I know you're going to say it's too jazzy.
I will give you one, which is that if we, as a nation state, can like rescue people in war zones, if we can send a Black Hawk helicopter to take out the world's most wanted terrorist at night, can't we do a similar thing to get Kendrick away from jazz musicians? Can't we rescue him with the full arm and weight of the United States military-industrial complex?
See, you say that,
Get
but
him
in
away
2
from
weeks
Flying
when
Lotus.
you're like institutionalized is the Magna Carta, like who knows? You might be thanking your lucky stars for that. That sound
I know.
wave.
I mean, I guess my feeling about it is this. I really admire the fact that this in no way sounds like a rap record released in 2015, in 2005, in 2010, 1995.
Yeah.
None of it. There are really no guests. I think Snoop shows up at one point. There's the most credited guest is a jazz bassist named Thundercat.
Yeah.
Like, I really, really admire all of that. That said, admiration isn't the same as liking or loving.
Right. It's been like about 12 hours since it came out. So, I mean, like, I understand that it doesn't have a, like, run through the six with my woes moment, but
or
it
a
might.
backseat
It's just
freestyle
buried
moment.
under some other stuff. What?
But there isn't a backseat freestyle moment either. I think we can agree on that.
No. I
and
think
it's
Black of the
just-
Berry is pretty close to that, though.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Black of the Berry is an
And it's
incredible
interesting,
track.
too, because this record comes out now, and, you know, only like a few months ago, Black Messiah came out, and Black Messiah probably is a little bit more is a little bit more digestible than this record in some ways, but a lot of what I think framed Black Messiah was stuff that was happening around Ferguson, and
there was
the
a
sort of
narrative that
surprise
came with it.
release, and it was like, this is clearly a reaction to this. Whereas this record, everything from the like, did you guys mean to put this out today, to like, I don't know who any of these producers are except for Pharrell, and like, or, you know, like people who are like, it's like Flying Lotus and Pharrell and Soundwave and Thundercat. Like, it's just this dense record that's going to need to be processed on its own. And frankly, like, I've been talking about records my whole life, and I've been reviewing them since I was like 20 years old. And, you know, I would, even on some of the most pop, easy to digest records, I would never want to be held to what I said about in the first 12 hours. So I'm just going to reserve judgment.
Good point. I'm with you on that. I support
You're talking
you
to
on
somebody
that.
who was wrong about College Dropout because he got the wrong version of it or whatever. But like, I was wrong about College Dropout.
Yeah.
That's like one of my favorite records, you know?
Absolutely. And I think that in Good Kid, Mad City, I think it took almost a full year for me to fall in love with the entire record. I mean, the tracks would start to bubble up and jump out. And I totally agree with you. I just feel like, and this is, I'm going to say this on record so I can be mocked for it later and we can bring it up because I think we should revisit this record. I just think that Kendrick Lamar is so good at rapping.
Yeah.
I think he's one of the best people alive currently at rapping.
Yeah.
And it reminds me a little bit of an Andre 3000 situation where someone who is one of the best there is to do it is more interested in doing other things. Now, that's a kind of a specious argument because he's rapping all over this record. He's just not
raps
doing
the
it.
shit out of this record. Yeah.
Yeah, he's just doing it in ways that aren't consistent with, like, I guess, jumping on a popular hook, or he's not doing, you know, it's not in ways that I was prepared to receive it, which is not an argument against its existence.
Well, here's the thing I want to have a conversation about at some point, because I think that you and I were probably of a generation of people who were heavily, heavily affected by that mid-aughts mixtape era where you got to start to be like, I just want to hear, like, it was almost fan service. You could be like, I want to hear my favorite rapper rap over my favorite beat. And it would happen more often, like every week. Every week,
totally
G-Unit
right.
would put out a mixtape. It seemed like that was like, here's the best beats and G-Unit rapping over. Here's We Got It For Cheap Part 2. Here's Dedication. Here's The Drought. Here's the Jay-Z Reebok mixtape. You know what I mean? Like, you didn't have to wait and hope that they picked the right producers. And so I think that in the last couple of years, it's been an adjustment almost to go back to like, okay, this guy's on his own vibe. Like, this guy's going to find his own voice.
That's such a good point because it wasn't just fan service. It was just like fantasy karaoke, basically.
It was exactly like that, yeah.
Because, you know, there was a period 10 years ago where, like, okay, so Interscope and Dre and everyone was putting all this money into The Game, who is kind of a mediocre rapper who had his moments. So there would be a Game track. He would get these titanic beats, and we would literally say, I can't wait to hear clips on that.
Yeah.
Because it would happen.
Or 50 doing Hate It or Love It or whatever, yeah.
It would all happen inevitably, and that is no longer the case. So I think that's a really good point. I think, again, he's winning the long-term war here. Like, he's making albums that are considered and thoughtful and completely unique that, you know, that defeat what we're doing, which is probably good.
I just want to see what younger people say about this record because I feel like they're less affected by like the sea change that we experienced that went back and forth with that stuff. Because for like, as we went into that and as mixtapes grew out of an extension of being basically like, you know, DJs taking an opportunity to record their showcasing of different artists and artists jockeying for placement on like Who Kid tapes or Clue tapes or whatever, as it changed into these are their own distinct, discrete artistic statements, and then flipped back to, well, now that that's been corrupted, these are like kind of an extension of our retail brand. Like, we've gone through all that. I think a lot of people who are like 23 right now are just like, Kendrick's just the shit, you know? Kendrick's just Jesus.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to make, because what's also shifted is that personal narrative is starting to outstrip radio play, for example. Because you think about like J. Cole, who I don't find that interesting or compelling as a rapper, got no radio play at first for this record he put out last year, and that record was the biggest selling debut of the year.
People love him. People love like the same way that like, and this is not uncommon. This is not unlike when like in the 90s, there would be these success stories like, this is going to sound ridiculous, but not unlike Counting Crows and Hootie and the Blowfish, who did a lot of college touring, and Dave Matthews, who did a lot of college touring and built up their own audiences, and then would put out a major label record that would go platinum in the first week, or like have these enormous hits, or at least have a baseline of success that they could build off of. And people would be like, where the hell did they come from? And it's like, they've just been playing South Carolina colleges for 6 years. But that's kind of like what happened with Wiz and J. Cole, is those guys played a lot of shows, and those guys like met the people and really built up actual fan bases.
Yeah, and I find, you know, I listen to Hot 97 every day, so I'm paying attention to that still as a barometer, when really it's not possible for that to be a barometer of anything. Yeah. I mean, Hot 97 is mostly playing Disclosure's Latch still, which is a 3-year-old British club track. Yeah. Like they don't have that narrative. And so when I say that I don't know if there's like that moment that I'm looking for in the Kendrick album, the truth is that groundswell coming up from the bottom is going to push something on that record onto the radio, whether it's Black or the Berry, whether they finally get behind I or whatever. That's going to change radio more than radio is going to change him.
I don't think it matters to him. Like, that's what I'm saying. It doesn't matter. You don't make a record like this if you care about that.
No, and I'm saying that's good. And so if that leaves us with a little more of a difficult conversation on our podcast the day after it comes out, that's fine.
Let's revisit it next week after we've been able to digest it more.
Next week. Let's revisit it in a month. Let's revisit it in a year. Let's put it in the time capsule. And, you know, let's also make a little time for, I want to talk to you about my man, Usher. Yeah, I had a lot of deep Usher thoughts.
All right, let's talk about Usher next week. It's been a thoughtful convo today.
It's been thoughtful. It's been low-key. I feel like, did we need some slapping?
I think the slapping takes it up a notch, but I like just looking at you with your coffee cup and just, this is like all things considered, man.
People don't realize that I'm just staring at your forearms this whole time. I thought this was a podcast, but it's a gun show. I had no idea.
All right, man. I'll see you next week.
Great job, Baranski!